are thrilled to have Gina Frangello with us this evening. Her fifth book, the memoir, Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason. Brooke is going to hold up a copy. Woo! I actually listened to the book on audio, so I don't have a copy, but there it is. Beautiful book. So that book has been selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice and received a ton of starred reviews. Gina is also the author of 4 books of fiction, including A Life in Men, which is currently under development by Charlize Theron's production company. Currently, Gina is the creative nonfiction editor at the LA Review of Books, and she brings more than 2 decades of experience as an editor, publisher, and writer in numerous outlets. Together with the writer Emily Rapp Black, she runs Circe Consulting, as in the goddess Circe, a full-service company for writers, and she can be found at ginafrangello.org. So Gina will be in conversation with Brooke Warner, who many of you know. Brooke is publisher of She Writes Press and Spark Press, president of Warner Coaching Incorporated, and the author of Write On Sisters and Greenlight Your Book, and What's Your Book, and 3 books on memoir. Brooke is a TEDx speaker, a weekly podcaster. The podcast is called Right Minded, and it's with co-host Grant Faulkner of NaNoWriMo. And she is a former executive editor at Seal Press. She sits on the boards of the Independent Book Publishers Association, the National Association of Memoir Writers, and the Bay Area Book Festival. And she's involved in Women Lit from the very beginning. She writes a monthly column also for Publishers Weekly. So we're honored to have both of you with us tonight, especially this week, because, come on, finish with the intro here. Wait a second.
I have something. I'm coming in with you.
I should have lit this before, because today is Brooke's birthday. Yay!
Yes, Gina's birthday was on Tuesday.
A few days ago, yes. So you do not want me to sing happy birthday, so I won't. It's a Virginia Woolf plate, okay? So we've got the whole, women's voice thing going. So happy birthday, Gina and Brooke, and I think everybody in the chat is also sending you happy birthday wishes. So now I'm going to go off camera, eat the cupcake. All right, so take it away.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Sherilyn. Thank you for that awesome introduction. And I'm always thrilled to be able to do these Women Lit events. And it's been obviously quite a year plus that we have moved these online, but it also gives us such an awesome opportunity to see so many of you from all over the country. And of course, to invite someone like Gina on a moment's notice, more or less. So Gina, just absolutely thrilled to have you and excited. Really excited to talk about your book tonight. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And I want to remind everyone that, as Sherilyn said, to put your questions as we go. I mean, I think this could and should be a robust conversation where people feel interested to say their own thoughts and feelings, because I want to start by saying what a giant impact your book has had. There's just been so much conversation online and in women's circles. I think people have really been moved in various ways. I know people have felt strong feelings, and that has been all the way from just in awe of your bravery to uncomfortable with how much you shared, to just, I've heard everything, right? And so I wanted to ask you, because I think that women are yearning to tell these kinds of stories. And if they could just open up their chest and let it all fly out, they would. But there's the filter of our minds that get in the way. And I wanted to ask what your experience was like to write such a really, it is a brave, but also a really tell-all book. And how did you handle your inner critic along the way?
Well, it probably helped that I thought that most of the book was just being written privately for me initially. I believed that I was putting together an essay collection about my parents, about caregiving my parents, who are major characters in the book. I'd published a bunch of short form essays about caregiving my parents, about growing up in our old neighborhood. And around 2015, 2016, when my father had died and I was getting divorced and I had been diagnosed with breast cancer, just so much was going on in my life that for the first time since I was literally 4 years old, I could not think about fiction. I had no ability to tap into that part of my brain. So I was like, I'll do this essay collection about my parents that I've always wanted to do. But on the side, I was writing all this stuff in secret about what was actually going on with me in my life. And I had no intentions of publishing any of it, but I did read some at a reading series in Chicago. And there was a response that led me to think, okay, maybe I'll show my writing group, which is a group of amazingly supportive women. And they said, you've got to go with this. So I had already, to a certain extent, unlocked that inner censor by that point. And so that probably made it a little easier.
And what had your experience been with memoir prior to this? Because you were a novelist and you said you were writing short pieces. So this just came. But what did you know of memoir, read of memoir?
So, of course, I read a lot of memoir, but I had been writing short essays and long essays since probably about 2001. The first one I ever wrote was about adopting my daughters from China. It was a cover story for the Chicago Reader, but then I started moving into more personal essay terrain. And so I'd been writing pretty intimate essays for a long time, but I had really never thought I was going to do a memoir, largely because I think that I mistakenly believed that, that I wouldn't be able to take as many risks formally, and that it would just be sort of me telling my story, here, this happened to me. And I was more compelled initially by being able to access truth through imagination, but it turned out that this was my most formally innovative book. So I guess, my preconceived notions about what a memoir would be were incorrect initially.
Well, and let's talk about that, because it is different. It's experimental. You have lists. You don't often go in chronological order. There's a lot of cultural criticism in there that is about more than just your story. And clearly, that's another thing when memoir, we're going to talk about some of the more controversial stuff too, because that's so interesting to people. But I think not following the traditional form of memoir can also agitate literary folks sometimes. So how conscious were you of wanting to break rules? How did you come to the form?
So basically, the pieces that I had mentioned before that I had written about my parents, and in fact, all of my short essays were mainly traditional form. I did have a tendency to sometimes maybe write in a little bit of a circle. I have a tendency to do that in a lot of my work, but there wasn't anything like lists, dictionaries, any of the things that ended up in this book in any of my short form nonfiction. So I didn't really know what was going to happen. But when I thought about my favorite memoirs, the ones that have really made a deep impact on me, starting with probably The Woman Warrior, which is by Maxine Hong Kingston, for anyone who's not familiar with it, which was written in the early 70s. I thought about the fact that those memoirs that take really imaginative, formal, and conceptual leaps were the ones that had impacted me the most. My partner, Emily Rapp Black, in my business, as you all just heard, tends to interweave a lot of philosophy, a lot of theology, certain pop culture into her work. My husband had written a memoir that was published in 2016, and he was really interrogating the nature of memory in his book, and he had a lot of outside sources. And I thought about the fact that as an editor, because I've been an editor for a really long time, the most common reason I would have for rejecting work that was actually quite well written and interesting was that it was too insular. It was only about the person who's writing it, and there wasn't a window out. And as soon as I started thinking about there being a window out, that was when the idea of a memoir really caught fire for me, when I realized that I could be the lens rather than the only subject.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's such a process for people. And I loved how it turned out. I mean, it's really fabulous. And I thought I would pause for a moment. I didn't want to start with this context, but I think it's interesting for people to hear the story of how you and I got connected, because people saw it unfold. A lot of the people who are here saw it unfold on Facebook. And of course, like a lot of people, I saw your review in the review of your book in the New York Times. Just thought to myself in a very kind of flippant way, like, oh, that's interesting, like such a meta, like, oh, it's about rage, and I'm probably not going to read that book, and just made a sort of offhanded comment on Facebook. And what was so moving to me was how many women came to your defense. It floored me, actually. I mean, I sat there just watching comment after comment after comment, people saying, you need to read this book, saying, I've known Gina for forever. This is amazing. And it stopped me in my tracks, and I knew immediately that same day that I would go and read the book. And it took me probably about 2 weeks, but I did. And then I posted on Facebook what was in essence a retraction, saying, whoa, this book blew my mind. And one of the things that I said was that, it just kind of made me burn. I felt like my mind was on fire, my heart was on fire. And I think you've elicited that kind of reaction in women. And so it's just interesting to see the extremes of the reaction, like some people who are deeply upset and kind of feel like you're raging, and other people who just feel like you've given them such freedom for what's possible in their own memoir. And so I wondered if you could speak to the scope of that reaction for yourself, and maybe talk a bit about what the fallout has felt like, since it's been positive and negative, which is interesting too.
Absolutely. One of the things that has been really fascinating is that even among the people who are writing to me because they love the book, because you don't usually get letters from people who didn't love the book, but from the people who are writing to me, there are two camps of people. One, I read it in 24 hours, and the other, I had to read it slowly and keep putting it down and walking away because it was very unsettling. And then I would come back and read it, a little bit more. And so that's been kind of fascinating to me that, that there are readers out there, I think mainly women, but obviously any readers out there who are kind of devouring it like they're breathing it in. And then there are others who are dipping their toe in, kind of trying to see what they think. But by the end, I hear from them. And so that's just been really interesting, and kind of indicated to me that, that people are still really uncomfortable with a lot of this content. Like the people who are reading it so quickly, I think, are so hungry for this kind of content. And then the people who are reading it slowly are kind of like, they're still testing the waters. They're not sure. They may close the book at any moment. So, it critically speaking, I mean, the original New York Times review that came out on my pub day was obviously not the highlight of my life. But, so that was unpleasant. But other than that, the critical reception has been, pretty positive. It's been more, I think, an interesting thing to see how individual people online are responding. That there are definitely people who are unhappy to read a book about infidelity. It's about a lot of other things besides infidelity. There are people who feel like, you shouldn't talk about that. I think there are also a lot of people who are, when I say uncomfortable, not in the same way of judging about infidelity, which of course is a hot topic for, everybody's judgment, and my own included, but even things like writing about breast cancer, writing about chronic pain, writing about my parents' slow debilitation and death, it's a very physical book. It's a book very rooted in the body. And I think that there are still so many taboos around women's bodies that even the aspects of my book that don't bring judgment of me as a person can still potentially make readers uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment, definitely. I mean, and I am glad you mentioned the physical, because there's also quite a lot of sex in the book. And, there were moments that I thought, oh my gosh, she's going all the way there. And it was unsettling and also incredibly relieving at the same time. I mean, I'm sure that's the paradox that people felt like, oh shit, this is real. This is something I've experienced or wanted to experience. I mean, you talk about eroticism, you talk about fantasy, and then of course your current husband, who is your lover for most of the book, is a memoirist himself and must have been supportive of the things that you put into your book, which I'm guessing is a blessing given your relationship. But how would you have handled that if he hadn't been? What would have happened if he had said, I don't want some of this stuff in your book?
Right. Well, I mean, I, of course, talked to him about that because, so initially, I had my own kind of back and forth about, I knew it would be a very physical book. And I think every piece of fiction and nonfiction I've ever written in my life has been profoundly physical. I was very influenced by the French feminist theorist, literature feminine, the imperative of writing our bodies, and people like Kathy Acker and Lydia Yuknavik and many writers who are deeply physical writers exploring women's bodies, Roxane Gay. I mean, there's so many. But at one point there weren't many at all. And I think that even now, when we can make a really long syllabus of these women, they're still in the minority. And that most books, it's assumed somebody has a body, but you just say, oh, the sex was amazing. I was so excited. It was so passionate. And it's like, what does that mean? That means something different to everybody. So when I talk to my students, I'll say, if you tell me that, this character is beautiful, I don't know what that means. If you tell me that this character is a bitch, I don't know what that means. If you tell me that this sex was amazing, I don't know what that means. And so I, as a teacher and as an editor, I deal a lot with specific detail. And so for me to be writing a book that was largely about both the body's failings and the body's ecstasies, right? I felt as though I had to suck up the, trepidation and be fairly frank. I mean, there's no such thing as tell all, right? And that's a whole other area of memoir discussion where it's like, your memoir is not a diary. But at the same point, no, I talked to my now husband, then lover, in the book. And I said, I'm really on the fence about whether to include any specifics of our sexual life. And I was particularly on the fence about whether to include any aspects of so-called kink. And the reason that I was really on the fence about that was not that I was embarrassed or that I felt like it was somehow unacceptable, but because I didn't want the reader to mistakenly think like, oh, she's sort of kinky. She met another person who's kind of kinky, so she left her husband. So I felt a need to then kind of excavate that, like the beginnings of my sort of sexual fantasies, sexual identity when I was coming of age, the fact that I was not going into this relationship with my then lover, now husband, as someone who had not already had a somewhat adventurous life. I didn't want the book to be reduced to that, but I also didn't want to be afraid of showing that, because I think that portrayals of, whatever you want to say, non-vanilla sex, I think that they tend to be too homogenous in literature, as in, kind of the Stephen Eliot brand of non-traditional sex. Like, I went to a dungeon, my girlfriend came and beat me up, came into the city to beat me up. And I've enjoyed a lot of these writers, but I don't read a lot of books where middle-aged people in serious relationships are also having, I guess, other than the sex that we might write into our mind if it just said we had sex and it was amazing. So I felt like it was important to be somewhat specific in order to essentially say to all the other women and men and everybody out there who are also not just kind of like disappearing into the quiet night of invisibility in middle age, or who are not just having missionary sex every time they have sex, like to basically say, like, this is part of the experience of love, of desire, of, you know, aging, that this is real. And there are people out there, your neighbors, your friends, like what we have been fed to believe about middle-aged women's sexuality is very limited. And I think that people need permission to first just even acknowledge that before they can write about it, and not think like, oh, I'm the only one. This is such a secret.
I appreciate that so much. And I think it is so much of, I mean, a lot of it speaks to how much bravery it takes to put something like that on the page, because there must be those moments that you're thinking, oh my gosh, you know, my neighbor is going to read this, the mom at school, you know, all of those moments. And I wanted to segue into something that you wrote or said in an LA Review of Books interview. I'm not sure if that was a written or live interview, but you wrote, many women tell lies out of a feeling of some fundamental lack of safety, and the feeling that we have to lie to keep men happy because incurring a man's anger feels dangerous. I loved that. And I think it's so true. I mean, it's true in life. It's true on the page. That's so much of what we do. And I will extend that obviously into our writing, is about how we are going to make other people feel, and that it's dangerous. And so I really appreciated that you wrote that, and you said, in the end, living in the shadows and leading a double life is not a feminist act unless your life would be endangered by telling the truth. That really seems to be the ethos of this book, like maybe what drove you. And I would just love for you to unpack that a little bit, because I just thought, yeah, that's the key right there.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, obviously there are a fair number of people here. They have not all read my book. So I'll give a little bit of context about that. I mean, definitely, you know, you do have a lot of fear about people reading these things. And in my particular case, I had come from a situation where I had been leading a double life. I had been having a clandestine on and off affair for 3.5 years. And so I was very much living in the shadows, not just in the sense that I was having an affair, which is, of course, a shadow of its own. But I say in the book, and I think, I think that this is something that maybe people who have been through addiction and recovery can relate to too, is that when you're doing something that is hidden and that is a lie, everything becomes a lie. So you go out to lunch with your girlfriends and, you know, you're not sitting there actively telling them lies. You can be saying like, oh, the kids and I did this, my husband and I did this. And it can all be true, but you're fundamentally dishonest by the fact that you just have this whole alternate life that is a secret. And so for me, when I finally did confess to my ex-husband, it wasn't as though now I was like, I'm going to unzip my body and step out and let the blood and guts fall everywhere. I mean, I have a sense of privacy, as everyone does, but I did feel as though I was no longer interested in trying to sort of like lead this alternate life that I wouldn't disclose to people. And so, for example, a friend of mine, one of the moms at my youngest school, had said to me, like, stop telling everyone that you had an affair. Like, stop telling everyone that's part of why you're leaving your marriage. You know, like, everyone's going to judge you. And I was like, I don't care. You know, I mean, and it's not like I don't care. I have no fucks to give. Oh, swagger. Like, it was just like, I'm exhausted. I can't do this anymore. Like, this is just a fact and I'm going to say it. And so I started writing about it. I mean, my affair was, was in a number of personal essays that I published prior to this book. And I just decided that, I really wanted to look shame in the face. And I realized that shame and fear are very linked. And so that goes back to kind of what you're talking about. I think that as women, many of us, obviously nothing can represent the experience of like 52% of the world, but many of us as women are sort of trained to read people and give them what they want. And, what does this person want me to say in response to that question? I'll say it. Make them happy. Oh, I get positive feedback from making them happy. Okay, that worked. I'll do it again with this person, and so a lot of us end up, I think, carrying that into our romantic relationships, whether they're with men or with women or anybody. But particularly, I think women who are in relationships with men are very, very anxious a lot of the time about having approval withdrawn, and in a sense, no longer having that protective auspice of having a man who says, like, she's valid, what she does is okay. And I realized that a lot of writing my fiction, writing certain essays, which had also been, everything I've written has been very physical and sexual, but I hadn't been afraid because I had the support of, a respectable partner and so forth, a man who said like, oh, she's a good writer, etc. And I realized I was a lot more scared now that I was divorced. And yet it felt even more urgent because I was just done with living on the dark end of the street, so to speak. I just couldn't do it anymore.
It's fascinating what you're saying, because there's so much about what works, obviously, is the authenticity, and a lot of people who have read the book have said that, it's so authentic, which is like you're being very truthful. And there is this unveiling that happens. And one of the things that I love that you do often in the book is like, well, I wish I could have said this, but instead, here's the ugly mess that I actually was. Right. And there's something so relatable about that, because you are strong and you want to be strong. But there's this scene in particular that stands out to me where your ex-husband is accusing you of being all of these things. He's like, oh, well, you're bipolar, you're a cutter, you have an eating disorder. And your response is, I wish I could say, you're a misogynist asshole. But instead, you're like pitifully coming to your own defense, like, oh no, not really, And it was a very moving part, because I think it's like there are two lenses through which we see ourselves sometimes, like this kick-ass, badass woman who's gonna just like, level everyone and say what we really think. And then there's this sort of like sniveling, reactive person that we can sometimes become. And I think that's very difficult to write on the page. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how to hold the paradox.
I do. I have a lot of thoughts about, I said the word swagger earlier, and I came to this book absolutely determined that this was not going to be a book of swagger. Like, I think that, I actually think I might have come under less criticism if the book had been full throttle swagger, because like, if you just march out there and are like, I did this, I'm not sorry, patriarchy bad, misogyny bad, everyone deserved it, I found my freedom, like, you're going to have a certain amount of people who are in the cheerleading section saying, go girl, whereas if you're like, yeah, like I did all these shitty things and I knew while I was doing them that they weren't right and that they were going to blow up, and that, I had gotten to a point where anything I did was going to devastate someone, where you get to that point, you've gone so far where there is no way out, or someone isn't going to be devastated. And I take that really seriously. Like, I take it really seriously, our human imperative not to willfully hurt other people, and so, I was wrestling constantly in the book with the fact that, yes, I'm now married to the man I had an affair with. I'm happy, it's It's not a disaster story. I didn't drive off the cliff, the Thelma and Louise cliff, which I talk a lot about, sort of the self-destructive nature of a lot of women's narrative and how that's been pushed on us very strongly. I've done it in some of my own fiction, and in my life, but that at the same point, there could be room for happiness while also room for acknowledgement that, like, you didn't get to this place in a clean way. And I actually think that, we have our swaggery authors. We have our swaggery feminist authors. I referenced Kathy Acker earlier. We have women who have basically been like, this is going to be a takedown of the way our culture runs. And I won't be implicated because I'm oppressed, right? I'm a woman and I'm oppressed. Like, I wanted to look at the way that I was complicit in not just my own quote unquote oppression, but in doing something shitty to another woman, in, lying to my friends and family, like including my children. So all of these things, it was important to me to hold that balance, because while I didn't want to self-flagellate, and I knew in advance by the time I was writing the book that it wasn't a book that was going to end with, and then I realized I was terrible and I went back and everything that I was, unhappy with was actually perfect. And yes, reaffirm the narrative of reassurance and all of that, but I was also like, I can't walk away from this and just have people think, oh, unhappy, have an affair, that it's so much more complex than that. And that essentially the system of sexism, particularly as white women, we participate in this, and we participate in the way that we cage ourselves, and we participate in not always having the best interest of other women at heart, and I think that these things are important. And if we don't talk about them, we just have two ends of a dichotomy. One where it's like, if I'm oppressed, then everything I do is justified. And the other is, I'm a terrible piece of shit. And, I have to repent endlessly and go back into my cave and be a good girl. And there is a broad swath between those two things that I think is not written into frequently enough.
Well, and I love that you did, because it's complex. I mean, that's another reason that maybe it's difficult, because you really get into the complexities of just the female experience and the female existence. And there are a lot of paradoxes. And in these events, women lit in general, so many of the women who come are writers themselves. And this event being about the freedom and the fallout, I mean, those two things also are dichotomies, right? But it's like, in doing your memoir, I feel this sense of freedom for you, releasing it, for the reader receiving it and being like, oh my gosh, I have the freedom to do this too. And that was another thing that I wrote in my review on Facebook. I felt that there was a again, like a double-edged thing there, which is on the one hand, giving women a lot of freedom because of what you've done. And on the other hand, setting the bar, in essence, of kind of a new way of thinking about memoir and doing memoir. And I wonder if you feel conscious of having done that with what you put forward.
Well, not as complimentarily as you just put it. I mean, obviously, thank you. That's really nice. I believe really strongly as a writer, as an editor, as a teacher that, first of all, we're all part of an ongoing conversation in literature, right? We're addressing, many things that have been said and written before. We're never the first one to say or do anything. That being said, we want to find new ways in. We want to find new ways of expressing things. And I didn't want to write a book that, people had read before. I really wanted to lean very far away from, I said, a narrative of reassurance. I wanted to go with that adage of like disturbing the comfortable and comforting the disturbed. And I really felt very strongly that that couldn't be done entirely. Like, even if I were like, interrogating my motives, even if I was being sexually frank, even if I was writing about the intricacies of pain and cancer and hip replacements and stuffing my parents' wounds with gauze and all of these physical things, I also felt like if I adhered to just this traditional narrative, that in a sense I was softening the blow in a way. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted the reader to feel a little off kilter and like they didn't know what was going to happen next. And I'm really obsessed with form imitating, form being in kismet with content. And so for me, I was in a lot of situations where I had no idea what was going to happen next. And that felt treacherous and that felt strange and really, really different from the way I had lived my life for a really long time. And so I felt like I wanted to break certain ways of storytelling, which I'm certainly not the first to do, but I mean, by any means, but I feel like we're still in this ongoing, dance with language. Like Pam Houston says, sometimes we must all conspire together to pretend that language can mean. Right. And I'm really interested in sort of that gap between language and experience and how you can get so close, but you can't go all the way there. Like if I write about a headache, I can't give you a headache. Like if but I want to get as close to that wire as I can. I've been obsessed with that my entire life as a writer, including in my fiction. And so for me here, sometimes the way into doing that meant just kind of breaking open what we think of as structure and narrative and accessing it in a different way.
Well, it's great. Treacherous is a good word. And I read so many memoirs, and there are very few that made me feel the way that your book made me feel. And there was definite discomfort and all kinds of things, but just that's why I'm saying that burning feeling, it's definitely something to aspire to, whatever it is, just to make your readers feel something. So kudos on that front. Before we move into the audience Q&A, I wanted to ask you about your publishing journey, because I know you're with Counterpoint, which is a small press here in Berkeley, where I live. And I'm curious if you tried to go with a big publisher and what their reactions were. I mean, did you face pushback on what you were trying to do from some of the other presses you tried to approach?
So I am an indie press girl. I ran a press. I launched a press. I have had books that were shopped to the big houses. Absolutely. Of course, I have a literary agent, and they always are going to try that to, try to get you a big pile of cash. But for my third book, A Life in Men, I had an offer from Nan Talese, which is part of Random House, and I had an offer from Algonquin. And the offer from Nan Talese was more than twice the amount of money as the offer from Algonquin. And I ended up going with Algonquin and was very supported by my agent in doing that. So, we did a little cursory shopping, but I knew I wanted to be back at Counterpoint. I had been with them in my last book. And I simply think that Dan Smetanka is the best editor in the business. I mean, he really made my last novel better. And I knew he would make this book as much as it could be. And I feared, I don't make a lot of money. So of course, if somebody would have been like, here is just absolutely a bucket of cash, I'm sure I would have been, tempted. But I knew I wanted to work with Dan because I knew he would make the book better. And he did. And one of the ways he did that was by immediately, essentially giving me industry or publisher permission to lean in hard to the critical theory parts, the cultural criticism parts, and to not make it more of a traditional memoir, which I feared very much would be the case if I was with a big house. And, so Dan bought the book when it was a bit of a mishmash. It was a bunch of kind of essays out of order. A lot of them ended up going. I wrote new things. I completely rewrote the book at Ragdale without his permission in 2 weeks, and then was like, here, now what? But he really helped me to first of all, not only eliminate repetition of both content and emotional notes, but also to widen that lens even more so that I was the thing you're looking through at something bigger than just me. And he saw the book that way, and I saw the book that way, and the publicist, Megan Fishman, saw the book that way. And I think that would be really hard to get at a lot of the, maybe if I were like already super famous, but I think, generally speaking, there is an idea that like a woman's memoir is supposed to be inspirational, a little bit bordering on self-help. Like, she's supposed to, in a sense, like position herself as like a guru that you can, like you model your life after this. If you do what she does, you'll be happy. I just wanted no part of that. And I was afraid that it could go that way.
I hope people will go back and listen to what you just said, because that's so fundamental. I mean, when I think of what memoir is, it's exactly that, that the body and experience of the protagonist, the memoirist, is the lens through which you see the world. And then everything that you did with regard to the cultural criticism is the reflection, is the takeaway, is the larger message. I wish all memoirists were doing that. So I know you've spoken so beautifully about your relationship with your editor. And so that's awesome too, because not everybody gets that. So wonderful story. Finally, just one comment more than anything, and then Sherilyn will come on and talk. And this is a really more a plug for anyone who has not read the book to go get it, because the final paragraph honestly could be a standalone piece. It is like a gorgeous piece of poetry. And I wanted to ask, where did that come from? It's so lovely.
That was part of the final part of the book, which is called The Cartographer's 50 Meditations. And it was written when I was 50. And it is the only part of the book that isn't linear. Like some parts of the book have flashback, but then we meet at the end where we're going to jump off from the next part. That part spans from 2000. Oh God, I talk about my interstitial cystitis in the late 90s, and it spans all the way to the time I'm 50. There's a lot of cultural criticism. It's not all just about me. But that part, that end was written really early on when I was writing in secret. That part was in there from the beginning. And I think, even when I was writing this just for myself, it's like it wasn't a journal. I was writing something that I didn't think I'd publish, but I was writing it as though I was writing it for another woman. And I came to realize that I was, in fact, writing it for other women, and that it was not okay to just keep it, and that I had to put it out there, even if it was scary as hell. So, yeah. And just also, since this is the end before we take questions, I do want to tell everybody that if you have not already bought the book and you do end up buying the book, all my royalties are going to a place called Deborah's Place in Chicago, which helps work with women who are facing homelessness. And so, I ultimately, despite my jokes about buckets of cash, which, are welcome if you want to send them to my house, but I ultimately really decided that I wanted this book to be something for other women on every level. And so, there are a lot of women out there who are facing similar problems to the ones I was facing. And there are a lot of women out there who are facing far graver problems and who do not have the time or inclination to read a book about my life, And so I wanted to be able to have this book help them as well, particularly in this situation where so much of the workforce that's been displaced during COVID has been women. I think something like 75%. So many women are facing dire economic circumstances right now. So I just wanted to contribute in that way.
Oh, Gina, thank you for writing this book for us. It's gorgeous, and congratulations on how far-reaching it's been. So thank you for this conversation, and we're going to bring on Sherilyn's voice.
And I'll tell you also,
from beyond.
Everybody here should also like just know, you didn't have to read this book. Like, you had already made a decision and you went and then read it. And then you not only talked about it on Facebook, but like have been championing it and me ever since then. And I think that's amazing. I think it's not something everyone would do. And I'm very appreciative of you.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's a book that is worth it and an author that is well worth it. So yes, yes to championing women.
Yes. Okay. So here's the voice from Voiceover Land. And just want to echo that Brooke just said about this is what women should do for each other. I mean, just help each other and sing each other's praises when something really touches us. So bravo to both of you for doing that. There have been a lot of questions about the impact of writing your truth on other people, of course, in, family, friends, around you. One question in particular was very personal and passionate and full of detail. So I'm going to keep the name anonymous for the recording, but here is her question. She says, I lost a sister to a massive overdose in 2018. My parents have requested that I do not disclose the cause of her death and to simply say that her heart, quote, stopped. My parents are understandably grieving as well as deeply private. How can I include the trauma of this event in my own memoir without losing my relationship with my family? I believe my sister would have wanted others to know the warning signs and how to prevent such a tragedy. And the pain of holding this secret is slowly eating me alive, physically and emotionally. Thank you for your feedback.
I hear in every cell of my body the weight of holding a secret and how it eats you alive from inside. There is no right answer to this question. I mean, you hear these adages like, write like everyone you know is dead. And, if people wanted to be portrayed nicely, they should have behaved better. And like these kind of quips, but life is more complicated than that. I'm sure that this person who wrote this question loves her parents and doesn't want them to be ashamed, these considerations are very real. And yet ultimately we own our stories, right? And I think a lot about the fact that no two people who have experienced a particular story experience it the same way. So if any of you out there have read, like, for example, Truth and Beauty by Ann Patchett, which was about her friendship with Lucy Greeley, who also had a drug problem and who died young. Lucy Greeley's family was quite unhappy with Ann Patchett's portrayal. In fact, they even said they weren't even that close of friends. Ann portrayed it like she was Lucy's best friend. It wasn't true. They were angry and it got press and so forth, but I love that book. And I feel like, this was something that was burning a hole in Ann Patchett and she needed to tell this. And I don't think that anybody else has the right to silence you. Now you have the ability to make a choice that, well, I'm just not going to do it. The cost is too great, but you have a right to do it, even if other people don't agree with you.
Okay. Thank you. Related question, just turning it into your particular book. How was it navigating the publication of this book with your children?
So I don't really talk about my children very much in events. So I'll just say that, that you're going to get a very vague answer here. My daughters are adults. My youngest is not yet an adult. Because my daughters are adults, I offered them the ability to take out anything that they wanted to take out, and they were not interested in being given that option. They they did not feel that that was something they wanted to partake in. And they said, it's your book, you're a writer, like write what you want. And there hasn't been any big drama. I mean, actually, there has not even been any small drama. So I get asked that question a lot, but it hasn't really been an issue, which I realize it could be in some families.
Mm-hmm. Brooke, do you have any comments on these questions? The early one.
I mean, there are so many good questions. I'm happy to kind of come in and just say more about that. I do think it's an interesting question about. I love that your kids were supportive. I mean, so many times parents and children are not. And one of the things that occurred to me about the woman who asked the question about, I don't know if I can do this to my parents. I've seen it said before, and I sort of like this, is like, write it. Don't put, we often say in our memoir classes that I teach with Linda Joy Myers, like, don't put the publishing cart before the writing horse. Like, the writing is not even done. You haven't even, I'm not saying about this woman because I don't know how far along your memoir is, but it's like the people are anticipating these things before they've even written the book. And it might take you 2 or 3 or 4 years to write the book. And so maybe there's just the permission to do it and then see how you feel after it's done.
I think that's so incredibly, incredibly smart, because I'll tell you that no matter how intimate a book feels, and I believe in intimate books, and I try to make all my books extremely intimate, every book you read is a curated thing that has been worked and reworked and revised with an editor, probably with your agent, with a writing group. Like, you're not getting the first cut. And so, maybe that adage of write like everyone is dead, that's your first draft. You can always cull, you can always pull back, and sometimes maybe for some people, the writing of it is enough. It doesn't always need to be published immediately. Writing art for art's sake is a very important thing. Not everything is about publishing. You may feel eventually like this story would be helpful to people, and that, like in this woman's case, that her sister would agree with that. And so you may choose to publish it, but writing your truth is the first step. Like, writing what you need to say is its own part of the process, for sure. Yes.
100%. And yeah, no, I am so glad that you doubled down on that, because I think that's one way forward. And, it's horrible to say they're going to wait until someone dies, but sometimes that is what needs to happen. And that's okay too. I did have actually an important question about meanness. People were reacting to you saying abandoning the good girl narrative, which I also think is really important. But then you've gotten some pushback publicly in reviews and elsewhere that you're mean, and I find that irritating, honestly, but I was curious, how do you process something like that? And is it something that gets to you at all? Or are you just like, whatever?
I don't, if I say that I'm not kept up at night by that, does it mean that I am in fact mean? I mean, I don't know. I don't think I'm particularly mean, and I don't think the people who know me think that I'm mean. So, but I also believe really strongly that we all bring ourselves to a text, and that, I've said this in quite a few interviews, that everyone who reads a book, even though the words are the same on the page, everyone is reading a different book. And so there are people whose own personal buttons, because of their lived experience, maybe their husband cheated on them, right? And they're reading this book about somebody who's like left their marriage, and their lover left his marriage, and they think like, you're an asshole. Like, they have a right to that opinion, because the book lands differently with everyone who reads it. And so there are going to be people who it does not land well with, because you're triggering things that have hurt them, and their story is real too, just as real as yours, so.
Well, and the thing about meanness too, is I think women who are direct are often called mean, and you're just like, I'm just saying what's true. But I did feel that you churned up a lot of really interesting stuff around the Kathy storyline, just around the complicated nature of that friendship, and that was also very honest and real. I felt it was resonant to me with different friendships I've experienced too.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, Kathy was survived by two sisters. She had another sister who actually died of the same thing. But she was survived by two sisters, and they have been unbelievably supportive of my writing about her, and have been, have loved what I've written about her and I think she would have. She was a person who was very interesting. I had written a short story that was largely based on her life, and I had shown it to her, and she dug it, So sometimes you have your own internal compass. You know what the person would think, and it kind of doesn't really matter what other people who don't know them think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sherilyn and I are debating whether to ask you the question that so many people are asking in the chat about about how you felt about the review.
I think I'll just echo what I just said, honestly. I did not feel happy, people. I did not feel happy. My phone was blowing up at 5:30 in the morning on West Coast time. I was out in California, and all my friends on the East Coast were texting me. My phone's exploding. I woke up early, which in and of itself is a no-no in my life. But obviously, the New York Times had previously ignored my existence. I'm an indie writer. Obviously, they had asked to run a whole chapter of the book, as an excerpt. And then I got this full page review. And so of course I'd been terribly excited. And then I was like, oh, fuck me, not so much. Obviously I was bummed, but at the same point, I feel don't write a book if you don't think anyone has the right to hate it, and do I think that the New York Times is always super professional about what they let reviewers say? I have opinions about that. My friend Sarah Centils wrote a book called Stranger Care that was essentially reviewed by somebody who had been fired from their job for racism, and who used Sarah's review as a platform to essentially say that Black women abuse their children more frequently, which is obviously not true. And to say that Sarah had the wrong motives for doing foster care because she wasn't driven by religion, and so people say things in reviews, and it's because they're having a reaction based on their subjective truth, right? It's the job of an editor to decide whether a review is presented professionally or not. The reviewer is reacting as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. That's enlightened path where you get to after the initial, few days in bed. So thank you, Gina, for telling us that story. Sherilyn, is there any final question?
Why don't I ask one sort of fun question? This is from Tegan and her daughter, Molly. So it starts with Tegan, and she says, "Dear Gina, your book is friggin' awesome and is doing more for me than I can tell you. I have more to say about that some other time, but right now my 10-year-old daughter, Molly, who is watching this with me, at the risk of me being a bad parent, it's almost 11 p.m. where we are, has a question. She's a writer, so I'll hand the keyboard to her to write it herself. Now, this is Molly who writes, "Hi, Gina, this is me, Molly, and in school we have creative writing, and I like to write about women's rights, racial segregation, things that are important to me. But my teacher read it and said to the class, keep the writing light, fun, and childish. And I'm like, is this creative writing or what? What is your advice about how to handle this properly and still write about what I love and what is important to me?"
So first of all, I love Molly because I was a writer from very early on. I started writing my first novel at 10, but before that I had been writing just stories and short books that I would write on these rolls of brown butcher block paper that my mom would like rip off for me to all be all the same size because I went through so much paper. We were really poor and it was cheap. I think some people are born writers. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are better writers, but some people are born writers and you have to write. I was that way. I mean, I was going to write. That was the end of the story. And it sounds like Molly is in a similar situation. You know, not everyone's going to understand your work. So in a sense, your teacher is presenting you with an opportunity to realize that, like, there will be people who push back. There will be people who don't want to hear the harder truths. There will be people who just want everything to be kind of light and entertaining. Maybe, you know, in order to obviously like pass a class, maybe you can't turn this teacher in certain things. That doesn't mean you can't keep writing it. And I think, you know, maybe also you can keep turning it into the teacher and stand your ground, you know, depending on like what the consequences of that would be. But, you know, that advice to keep it light, women get that, grown women my age in their 50s get that kind of advice in the publishing industry. And it's a load of crap. It's the way they think that they can sell books and get us in Target and get us in Costco and, like, you know, slap someone with a bikini on the cover and so on and so forth. And, you know, the earlier you're writing against that and the earlier your whole generation is writing against that, the better. So I say go.
I love that, Gina. And my gosh, so much of who you are, it shines through, you know, here and in your book and all of this directness and exactly what the women are wanting to hear tonight. So thank you for that. Thanks for just being exactly who you are. We're super grateful that you were here with us tonight. And we're going to move to let all of you know that our sponsor tonight, our bookseller tonight, is Sausalito Books by the Bay. So please, if you haven't bought the book, or if you'd like to buy the book again as a gift, which you should for any woman you know, please support Sausalito Books by the Bay. When you can order, the link will be here in the chat window so that you can do that. And we all need to support our indie bookstores so that they can continue to thrive and survive. So thank you to Sausalito Books by the Bay. And especially thank you to Women Lit Unbound for existing and for bringing these kinds of amazing conversations. And I'm going to bring Sherilyn back to close out the evening. So thanks again, Gina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right. Well, thank you all. And Molly, I don't know if you have been watching the chat, but it is like blown up with people saying, go Molly, and giving you like advice and you know, so email us and we'll send you a transcript of the chat. I think because it would be a fun thing to see and, you know, to pin up on your bulletin board for a little bit of courage from the members of Women Lit in our community. So info@baybookfest.org, and we will send you the transcript of the chat. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. And I want to thank She Writes Press, as well as all of our supporters who made this night possible. And that's it. Thank you for attending, and go read on and enjoy this book. Take care. Good night.
Thank you so much.